The whispers of spring danced through the dusty streets of Lyndon, Colorado. But the approaching footsteps of Caleb Norris sent townspeople scurrying like mice before a hungry cat. His spurs jangled a warning melody that even the bravest men heeded, a sound that had become synonymous with trouble since his arrival 3 years prior in 1875. "Morning, Mr. Norris," stammered the young shopkeeper, nervously adjusting his spectacles as the tall, broad-shouldered cowboy darkened his doorway. The shopkeeper's trembling hands betrayed his fear as he reached for items on his list. Caleb merely grunted in response, his steel-gray eyes surveying the general store with customary suspicion. At 32, his face was weathered from years under the merciless western sun, a jagged scar running from his right temple to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a knife fight that had left the other man dead. The scar pulled his lip into a permanent half-sneer that matched the reputation he'd cultivated like a prized crop. "Your supplies, sir," the shopkeeper said, placing the final item, a tin of coffee, on the counter with unsteady hands. "Will there be anything else?" "Ammunition," Caleb replied, his voice like gravel underfoot. "Rifle cartridges, the good kind." The bell above the door chimed as it swung open, momentarily distracting Caleb from his transaction. The woman who entered moved with quiet confidence, her honey-colored hair swept up beneath a modest bonnet. Unlike others who entered a room containing Caleb Norris, she didn't flinch or avert her gaze. "Good morning, Mr. Peterson," she addressed the shopkeeper warmly, then nodded politely to Caleb. "Sir," Caleb stiffened. Most women in town crossed the street to avoid him. This one had looked him straight in the eye, a bold action that left him momentarily disconcerted. "Miss Page," the shopkeeper replied, visibly relieved by her presence. "Your order arrived on yesterday's stage. One moment." Caleb watched from the corner of his eye as she browsed the shelves, seemingly unperturbed by his proximity. Her dress was simple but well-made, a deep blue that complemented her fair complexion. She carried herself with the dignity of someone who knew her worth. "Here you are, Miss Page, books for the schoolhouse as requested." The shopkeeper placed a brown paper package on the counter. "Schoolhouse." Caleb found himself asking, immediately regretting the display of curiosity. Pearl Nichols turned to face him fully, and Caleb was struck by eyes the color of summer sage. "Yes, Mr. Norris," he supplied, surprised by his own cooperation. "Mr. Norris, I'm the new school teacher. Arrived last week from Boston." She extended a gloved hand. "Pearl Nichols." Caleb stared at her hand as if it might transform into a rattlesnake. After an awkward moment, he reluctantly accepted it, his calloused palm dwarfing her delicate fingers. He released her quickly, uncomfortable with the unfamiliar sensation of touching something so refined. "Teachers don't usually last long in Lyndon," he said bluntly. Pearl's smile didn't waver. "Then I shall be the exception, Mr. Norris." With that, she gathered her package, paid for her purchases, and departed with a gentle "Good day, gentlemen." The shopkeeper exhaled audibly after the door closed behind her. "Miss Nichols is determined to make a difference here. Shame about the schoolhouse, though." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What about it?" Roof's halfway to collapsing. "Town council says there's no money to fix it properly." Peterson shook his head. "She's been teaching under a tarp when it rains. The children love her already." Caleb paid for his supplies without another word, his mind unexpectedly occupied with thoughts of sage green eyes and a hand that didn't tremble at his touch. The following days found Caleb unusually restless. The solitude of his small ranch outside town, once his sanctuary, now felt empty in a way he couldn't articulate. During his weekly supply run to Lyndon, he found himself passing by the schoolhouse, a dilapidated structure at the edge of town. Peterson hadn't exaggerated. The roof sagged perilously, several patches visible where amateur repairs had been attempted. Through the open windows, he could hear Pearl's clear voice reading a passage from what sounded like a history book. Her audience of 12 children of varying ages sat transfixed, even the older boys who typically scorned education. As if sensing his presence, Pearl glanced up, meeting his gaze through the window. Rather than showing alarm, she offered a small smile and a nod before returning to her lesson. The simple acknowledgement unsettled him more than any confrontation could have. Later that afternoon, Caleb found himself in the town's only saloon, nursing a whiskey and pointedly ignoring the berth other patrons gave his corner table. "Heard you were watching the schoolhouse today, Norris," came a sneering voice. Hank Wheeler, the town deputy, approached with the cockiness of a man backed by the authority of his badge. "Got an interest in education now?" Caleb regarded him coldly. "Just passing by." Wheeler's lips curled. "Best you stay away from Miss Nichols. Town's got enough troubles without you frightening our new teacher back east." "Didn't seem frightened to me," Caleb replied, taking a deliberate sip of his whiskey. "That's because she doesn't know what you are." Wheeler leaned closer, lowering his voice. "A killer, a man so mean his own family won't claim him." The words struck a nerve Caleb thought long deadened. His hand tightened around his glass, but he maintained his stony expression. "You done?" Wheeler straightened, adjusting his vest. "Just a friendly warning. Sheriff Blake may tolerate you because you keep to yourself, but step out of line, and that badge won't protect you." After Wheeler sauntered away, Caleb drained his glass and left a coin on the table. The afternoon sun hit him like a physical force as he stepped onto the boardwalk, squinting against its brightness. Mr. Norris. Pearl Nichols stood a few feet away, a basket over her arm containing what appeared to be fresh bread from the bakery. "Miss Nichols," he acknowledged stiffly, preparing to move past her. "I saw you earlier," she said, falling into step beside him, seemingly oblivious to his desire for solitude. "At the schoolhouse." Caleb grunted noncommittally. "I was wondering if you might have an opinion on our roof situation," she continued, undeterred by his lack of enthusiasm. "Mr. Peterson mentioned you're handy with repairs, and I've exhausted my appeals to the town council." Caleb stopped walking. "Peterson said that?" Pearl's cheeks colored slightly. "Well, no, he mentioned you have a well-maintained ranch. I merely inferred the rest." Despite himself, Caleb almost smiled at her admission. "Why ask me? Plenty of men in town would help a lady in distress." "I've asked," she replied, her frustration evident. "They cite budget constraints and other priorities. Meanwhile, my students get soaked whenever it rains." Caleb studied her, looking for signs of the manipulation he'd grown accustomed to from others. He found none, only genuine concern and determination. "I can take a look," he found himself saying. "No promises." The brilliant smile that illuminated her face caught him off guard. "Thank you, Mr. Norris. Would tomorrow after lessons be convenient, around 3 o'clock? Caleb nodded once, already wondering what madness had possessed him to agree. "Excellent. I'll have coffee waiting." With that, she continued down the street, leaving Caleb to wonder at the strange turn his day had taken. True to his word, Caleb arrived at the schoolhouse the following afternoon. The children had dispersed, but Pearl remained, arranging books on a shelf. She turned at his entrance, that same open smile greeting him. "Mr. Norris, thank you for coming." She gestured to a steaming cup on her desk. "Coffee, as promised." Caleb accepted it awkwardly, unaccustomed to such hospitality. The coffee was strong and sweetened with a touch of sugar, exactly how he preferred it, though he couldn't recall ever sharing that information. For the next hour, he examined the roof structure, inside and out, while Pearl graded papers at her desk. The damage was worse than it appeared from the outside. Years of neglect had rotted several support beams. It wasn't a simple patch job. The entire roof needed rebuilding. "It's bad," he told her bluntly when he finished his assessment. "Whole thing needs to come down and be rebuilt proper. Otherwise, first heavy snow will collapse it completely." Pearl's face fell, but she quickly composed herself. "I see. What might something like that cost?" Caleb named a figure that made her pale. "That's more than the town council allocated for the entire school year." "Figured as much," he said, finishing his coffee. "You'd need lumber, proper shingles, nails, tar paper, and someone who knows what they're doing to put it all together." "And I suppose you know what you're doing?" she asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. "Built my own house," he replied simply. "It doesn't leak." Pearl studied him, her head tilted slightly. "Would you consider taking on the job?" "I can't offer much payment, but I don't need your money," Caleb interrupted, surprising himself with the offer forming in his mind. "I've got lumber seasoning in my barn. Was going to build a new stable, but the roof's more important." Pearl's eyes widened. "Mr. Norris, I couldn't possibly accept. You asked for my help," he said gruffly. "This is it, take it or leave it." She regarded him silently for a moment, then nodded. "When can you start?" "Saturday. No school then. I'll bring the supplies." He moved toward the door, uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Mr. Norris," she called as he reached for the handle. "Why are you doing this?" Caleb paused, considering the question. "Kids shouldn't get wet while they're learning," he finally said, and left before she could respond. Saturday dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for construction. Caleb arrived at the schoolhouse with his wagon loaded with lumber, tools, and supplies, expecting to work alone. To his surprise, Pearl was waiting, dressed in practical trousers beneath a simple skirt, her hair tied back with a ribbon. "I hope you don't mind some assistance," she said, gesturing to 3 teenage boys who emerged from behind the schoolhouse. Thomas, Samuel, and William have volunteered to help in exchange for extra credit. The boys, ranging from 14 to 16, regarded Caleb with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He recognized them from town, but had never exchanged words with any of them. Ever built anything before? He asked them directly. The oldest, William, straightened his shoulders. "Helped my pa build our barn last summer. I can hammer nails," offered Samuel. "I'm stronger than I look," added Thomas. The youngest and smallest of the trio, Caleb assessed them critically, then nodded once. "All right. Start unloading the wagon, carefully." As the boys scrambled to comply, Pearl approached him with a basket. "I've brought food and water. It's going to be a long day." The gesture, simple as it was, caught him off guard. "You didn't have to do that." "Perhaps not," she replied with a small smile. "But I wanted to." The work began in earnest, with Caleb directing the boys on how to safely remove the old shingles and rotted beams. Pearl proved surprisingly capable, organizing supplies and keeping everyone hydrated as the sun climbed higher. By midday, they had stripped the roof to its frame and were breaking for the lunch. Pearl had prepared thick sandwiches, apples, and molasses cookies that the boys devoured eagerly. "Where did you learn carpentry, Mr. Norris?" Pearl asked as they sat in the shade of a large oak tree. Caleb, unaccustomed to personal questions, initially tensed, but something about the genuine interest in her expression loosened his guard slightly. "My father was a carpenter. Worked alongside him from the time I could hold a hammer." "Is he still in the trade?" she inquired. "He's dead," Caleb replied flatly. 15 years now." Pearl's expression softened with empathy, not pity, a distinction Caleb appreciated. "I'm sorry for your loss. My own father passed 3 years ago. It doesn't get easier, does it?" The unexpected commonality created a brief moment of connection. "No," he agreed quietly. "It doesn't." The afternoon proceeded with a rhythm that felt almost companionable. The boys, initially wary, began asking Caleb questions about carpentry and ranching. He found himself answering more fully than he'd intended, demonstrating proper techniques and explaining the reasoning behind certain construction methods. "You're a natural teacher," Pearl observed as they watched Thomas successfully install a section of support beam under Caleb's guidance. Caleb snorted. "Not likely, just don't want them doing it wrong." Pearl's smile suggested she didn't believe his dismissal. Teaching isn't about having all the answers, it's about guiding others to discover their capabilities. By sunset, they had completed the frame reinforcement and laid the tar paper, ready for shingles the following day. The boys, despite their exhaustion, displayed proud grins at their accomplishments. "Same time tomorrow," William asked Caleb directly, something few in town dared to do. Caleb nodded. "Sunrise, shingles won't lay themselves." As the boys departed, Pearl handed Caleb a canteen of fresh water. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the roof, but for how you treated the boys today. They've heard stories about you, you know." "Most people have," he replied, accepting the water. "Most people," Pearl said thoughtfully, "rarely look beyond stories to discover the truth." Before he could respond to this cryptic statement, she gathered her belongings. "Until tomorrow, Mr. Norris." Caleb watched her walk toward town, a peculiar weight in his chest that he couldn't identify. The day had been not unpleasant. It had been a long time since he'd worked alongside others, longer still since he'd shared a meal in companionable conversation. The following day brought similar weather and expanded help word had spread about the schoolhouse repairs, and 2 more students arrived with their fathers, men who normally avoided Caleb but seemed willing to set aside their apprehension for the sake of the school. Under Caleb's direction, the shingles were laid methodically, row by row. Pearl moved among them, offering water, food, and encouragement. Occasionally, Caleb would catch her watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher, not fear or wariness, but something more contemplative. By late afternoon, the new roof was complete. The assembled group stood back to admire their handiwork, a sense of collective accomplishment palpable in the air. "It's beautiful," Pearl declared, her face alight with genuine joy. "Children won't have to worry about rain or snow during their lessons anymore." One of the fathers, Jacob Miller, cleared his throat. "Norris, that's fine work, better than I expected." Coming from Miller, who had once crossed the street to avoid passing near Caleb, the comment was practically effusive praise. "The inside ceiling still needs patching," Caleb pointed out, uncomfortable with the attention. "Plasters cracked in several places." "We can handle that," Miller volunteered, surprising everyone including himself. "Can't we, boys?" The other men nodded, seemingly caught up in the momentum of goodwill. As the group dispersed, Pearl approached Caleb, who was packing his remaining tools into the wagon. "Would you join me for dinner tonight?" she asked. "As thanks for everything you've done." Caleb stilled, a saw in his hand. "Not necessary." "I know it isn't necessary," she replied patiently, "but I'd like to properly thank you. 7 o'clock at my boarding house, Mrs. Sullivan has given me use of her private dining room." Caleb knew he should refuse. Getting further entangled with the schoolteacher could only complicate his carefully constructed solitude, yet he found himself nodding. 7. Pearl's smile was radiant. "Wonderful." "It's the White House with blue shutters, just past the church." After she left, Caleb finished loading his wagon, his thoughts in unusual disarray. He couldn't remember the last time he'd been invited to dinner, let alone by a respectable woman like Pearl Nichols. What was she playing at? People didn't seek out his company without ulterior motives. Yet, despite his suspicions, 7 o'clock found him standing on the porch of the Sullivan boarding house, freshly bathed and wearing his least worn shirt. He'd even trimmed his beard, a concession to propriety that felt foreign. Mrs. Sullivan, a widow in her 60s with shrewd eyes, answered his knock. "Mr. Norris," she greeted him, neither friendly nor hostile. "Miss Nichols is expecting you. This way." She led him to a small dining room at the rear of the house, where Pearl waited beside a table set for 2. The room was modest but made warm by the glow of oil lamps and the aroma of roast chicken. "Mr. Norris," Pearl greeted him, her smile genuine. "Thank you for coming." Caleb removed his hat, holding it awkwardly. "Miss Nichols, please sit," she gestured to the chair across from her own. "Mrs. Sullivan has prepared a special meal in your honor. She was quite impressed with your work on the schoolhouse roof." Mrs. Sullivan, who had followed Caleb into the room, gave a non-committal HMPH, but nodded slightly before departing. The dinner began with palpable tension, at least on Caleb's part. He was acutely aware of his rough manners compared to Pearl's refined ones, though she made no comment when he used the wrong fork or drank his water too quickly. "How long have you lived in Lyndon?" Pearl asked after they had been served the main course. 3 years, Caleb replied, cutting his chicken with more concentration than necessary. And before that, he glanced up, finding only curiosity in her expression. "All over, Missouri, Kansas, New Mexico territory." "What brought you to Colorado?" Caleb hesitated. The truth that he'd fled Kansas after killing a man in a fair fight, only to be hunted by the man's vengeful brothers, wasn't suitable dinner conversation. "Land was cheap," he said instead. "Wanted a place of my own." Pearl seemed to sense his discomfort with personal questions and changed tack. "Your ranch, what do you raise?" This safer topic allowed Caleb to relax marginally. "Horses, mainly, some cattle, enough to get by. You live there alone." "Just me and the animals," he confirmed. Pearl tilted her head slightly. "That sounds rather lonely." "Prefer it that way," he said automatically, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Do you?" she asked softly, her gaze direct. Truly, the question hung between them, simple yet devastating in its insight. Before Caleb could formulate a response, Mrs. Sullivan entered with apple pie for dessert, temporarily saving him from Pearl's penetrating observation. As they ate the pie, which was admittedly excellent, Pearl shared stories of her journey west from Boston and her first impressions of Lyndon. She spoke of her family, a mother still in Boston, a brother who'd settled in California, and her decision to become a teacher. "I wanted to make a difference," she explained, her passion evident. "Education is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter if a child is rich or poor, from a prominent family or no family at all. Knowledge offers possibilities that might otherwise remain closed." "Noble thinking," Caleb commented, not unkindly. "But the world doesn't always reward nobility." Pearl regarded him thoughtfully. "Perhaps not, but I'd rather strive for better and occasionally fail than surrender to cynicism without trying." The evening concluded with coffee, during which Caleb found himself more relaxed than he'd been in years. Pearl's conversation flowed easily, neither demanding nor superficial. She listened as much as she spoke, a quality Caleb hadn't experienced in a companion since before the war. As he prepared to leave, retrieving his hat from the hook by the door, Pearl touched his arm lightly. "Thank you again, Mr. Norris, not just for the roof, but for this evening." Caleb looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then at her face, open, sincere, without a trace of the fear or disdain he'd grown accustomed to seeing in others. "Caleb," he said gruffly. "My name's Caleb." Her smile softened. "Then thank you, Caleb. I hope we might continue our acquaintance." "Why?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Raw and honest, Pearl didn't flinch. "Because beneath that formidable exterior I see someone worth knowing, someone gentle." Caleb almost laughed at the absurdity of the description. "Gentle? You've got the wrong man, Miss Nichols." "Pearl," she corrected. "And I don't believe I do. Good night, Caleb." He rode home under a canopy of stars, her words echoing in his mind. Gentle. No one had used that word to describe him since he was a boy, before the war, before life had taught him that gentleness was a luxury afforded only to those who didn't need to fight for survival. Yet something about the way she'd said, it made him want to prove her right. The following weeks saw a gradual shift in Caleb's routine. His trips to town, once limited to necessity, increased in frequency and duration. He found reasons to pass by the schoolhouse, a loose shutter that needed fixing, a bookshelf that required reinforcement, a squeaky door hinge that demanded oil. Each time, Pearl welcomed him with the same warmth, often inviting him to stay for coffee after the children had departed. Their conversations ranged from books — she was surprised by his literacy and knowledge of classics — to politics. They disagreed amicably on several issues, to their respective pasts she shared freely. He offered carefully edited versions. The townspeople noticed the change in Caleb's habits. Whispers followed him down the street, some curious, some disapproving. Deputy Wheeler made pointed comments about corrupting influences whenever their paths crossed, which Caleb ignored with increasing difficulty. One Saturday in late May, Caleb was repairing a broken step at the schoolhouse entrance when Pearl arrived carrying a basket. "I thought you might enjoy a picnic lunch," she suggested, holding up the basket. "It's such a beautiful day." Before he could formulate an excuse, they were seated beneath the same oak tree where they'd rested during the roof repairs. A checkered cloth spread between them, laden with bread, cheese, cold chicken, and apple cider. "You're different than when I first arrived," Pearl observed as they ate. "Less guarded," Caleb picked at a piece of bread. "Am I? Indeed. The children have noticed too. Bobby Miller told his mother you smiled at him yesterday. She nearly fainted from shock." Despite himself, Caleb chuckled. Didn't realize it was such a noteworthy event. Pearl's expression turned more serious. "People fear what they don't understand, Caleb, and you've made yourself difficult to understand." "Maybe there's not much to understand," he countered, though without his usual edge. "I disagree," she said simply. "I've seen how carefully you measure lumber to avoid waste, how you showed Thomas to hold a hammer to prevent blisters, how you leave fresh apples on my desk when you think I'm not looking." Caleb shifted uncomfortably, caught in his anonymous gifts. "Just had extras." Pearl's smile was knowing. "Of course." She reached across the blanket, her hand coming to rest lightly on his. You're a good man, Caleb Norris, gentle in ways that matter. He didn't withdraw his hand, though every instinct urged caution. You keep using that word, don't know why. Because it's true, she said with quiet conviction. I've watched you these past weeks. You're careful with fragile things, patient with the children, mindful of others' feelings despite your gruff exterior. Her fingers tightened slightly around his. That's gentleness, Caleb. It's strength under control. Something tightened in his chest, an emotion he couldn't name, didn't want to examine too closely. You see what you want to see, he said roughly, finally pulling his hand away. Pearl wasn't deterred. I see what others are too frightened or prejudiced to notice. I see you. The declaration hung between them, too intimate to dismiss, yet too profound to acknowledge. Caleb busied himself with packing away the remains of their lunch, his thoughts churning. The moment was interrupted by approaching hoofbeats. Deputy Wheeler rode up, his expression darkening at the scene before him. Miss Nichols, he greeted her, pointedly ignoring Caleb. Everything all right here? Pearl rose gracefully, her smile polite but cool. Perfectly fine, Deputy. Mr. Norris and I were just enjoying lunch after he repaired our schoolhouse steps. Wheeler's eyes narrowed. I see. Mind if I have a word with you, privately? Before Pearl could respond, Caleb stood. I should be going anyway, got chores waiting. He nodded to Pearl. Thank you for lunch, Miss Nichols. Pearl, she corrected firmly, giving Wheeler a pointed look. And you're welcome, Caleb. Same time next Saturday. The invitation, issued so publicly before the disapproving deputy, was clearly deliberate. Caleb felt a surge of admiration for her courage, even as he worried about the potential consequences for her reputation. If you'd like, he replied carefully. I would, she confirmed, her gaze steady. As Caleb departed, he could hear Wheeler's low, urgent voice and Pearl's measured responses, though he couldn't make out the words. He hoped her association with him wouldn't cause her trouble, yet selfishly, he couldn't bring himself to end it. The following day, Caleb was tending his horses when a rider approached his property. Sheriff Blake, a grizzled veteran who had maintained an uneasy truce with Caleb since his arrival in Lyndon. Norris, Blake greeted him, dismounting stiffly. Got a moment. Caleb set down his brush and stepped out of the corral. Sheriff, Blake removed his hat, running a hand through thinning gray hair. Heard you've been spending time with our schoolteacher. News travels fast, Caleb commented neutrally. Small town, Blake shrugged. Wheeler's got concerns. Wheeler's always got concerns where I'm involved. The sheriff regarded him steadily. He thinks you might be a bad influence on Miss Nichols, says your friendship could undermine her standing in the community. Caleb's jaw tightened. Pearl's a grown woman, makes her own decisions. Pearl is it? Blake raised an eyebrow. Look, Norris, I don't much care about your personal affairs. You've kept your nose clean since settling here despite your reputation. But Miss Nichols is well liked and this town needs a good teacher. You saying I should stay away from her? Caleb asked bluntly. Blake sighed. I'm saying tread carefully. Tongues are wagging. The school board's taken notice. Would be a shame if they decided she wasn't a suitable influence on the children because of her associations. The implication was clear. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides. That's not fair to her. Fair's got nothing to do with it, Blake replied pragmatically. Just thought you should know what's being said. He replaced his hat and moved toward his horse. For what it's worth, I think Wheeler's full of hot air, but I'm not the one you need to worry about. After the sheriff departed, Caleb paced his property, anger and frustration churning within him. The logical course was clear: distance himself from Pearl before her reputation suffered irreparable damage. She deserved better than to be tarnished by association with him. Yet the thought of ending their friendship, or whatever it was becoming, felt like contemplating the amputation of a limb. In just weeks, she had woven herself into the fabric of his life, bringing color to a world he hadn't realized had faded to shades of gray. The decision weighed on him through the night and into Monday morning. By noon, he'd resolved to speak with Pearl directly, to explain the situation and give her the choice, though he'd make it clear what he thought she should decide. He rode into town with a heavy heart, arriving at the schoolhouse just as the children were being dismissed for their midday meal. They scattered at his approach, all except young Bobby Miller, who waved shyly before running to catch up with his friends. Pearl emerged moments later, her face lighting with pleasure at the sight of him. "Caleb, this is unexpected. Were you looking for me?" "Need to talk to you," he said, dismounting. "It's important." Something in his tone must have alerted her, for her smile dimmed slightly. "Of course." "Come inside." Once in the privacy of the schoolroom, Caleb removed his hat, turning it nervously in his hands. "Sheriff Blake paid me a visit yesterday." Pearl's expression grew serious. "About us, I presume," he said. "The school board's taking notice of our friendship. Said it might affect your position here." Pearl sighed, not appearing surprised. "Deputy Wheeler made similar insinuations yesterday. I told him my personal associations were none of the board's concern." "But they are," Caleb insisted. "Your job, your reputation are mine to manage," she interrupted firmly. "Caleb, I'm aware of the risks. I chose them with open eyes." Caleb ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "You don't understand. This town, these people, they've already decided who I am. What I am. They won't change their minds, and they'll punish you for seeing something different." Pearl stepped closer, her expression earnest. "Then perhaps it's time they learn to see differently too." "That's not how the world works, Pearl." "It can be," she insisted. "It has to be, or what hope is there?" She took his hands in hers, a gesture so trusting it made his chest ache. "I know who you are, Caleb Norris, a man who rebuilt a schoolhouse roof because children were getting wet, a man who leaves apples on a teacher's desk and thinks no one notices. A man who is gentle when he believes no one is looking." Caleb stared at their joined hands. "I'm not the man you think I am," he said softly. "I've done things, we've all done things," she interrupted. "Made choices we regret, taken paths we wish we hadn't. What matters is who we choose to be now." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "I don't want to ruin your life." Her smile was soft, understanding. "You won't, but you might just improve it immeasurably." With a boldness that surprised him, she rose on her tiptoes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "I should prepare for my afternoon lessons. Will I see you Saturday?" Caleb knew he should say no. Instead, he nodded, unable to deny himself the one brightness in his life. The week passed in a haze of uncertainty. Caleb threw himself into ranch work, exhausting his body in hopes of quieting his mind. By Saturday, he had repaired fences, reorganized his barn, and begun clearing land for an expanded garden, all while wrestling with his conscience about Pearl. He arrived at the schoolhouse at noon, as agreed, to find Pearl waiting with another picnic basket and a determined gleam in her eye. "I thought we might try something different today," she announced. "The creek just north of town is lovely this time of year and more private than the schoolyard." Caleb understood her meaning immediately. She wanted to avoid prying eyes and wagging tongues. "You sure about this?" "Absolutely," she replied with a confidence he envied. "I've packed enough for both of us and brought a book I think you'll enjoy." They rode north, Caleb on his horse and Pearl on a gentle mare borrowed from Mrs. Sullivan's stable. The creek she'd mentioned wound through a stand of cottonwoods, creating a secluded haven of dappled sunlight and the soothing sound of running water. As they spread their blanket and unpacked the food, Caleb noticed Pearl seemed different today, more animated, with a touch of nervousness beneath her usual composure. "I've been thinking," she said as they settled with their plates, "about what you said regarding the town's opinion of you." Caleb tensed, preparing for the inevitable her realization that continuing their association was too costly. "You mentioned they've decided who you are," she continued, "but you never told me your side of the story." Her gaze was direct, unflinching. "I'd like to hear it, if you're willing to share." The request caught him off guard. No one had ever asked for his version of events, his justifications or regrets. They simply heard rumors and formed judgments accordingly. "It's not a pleasant tale," he warned. "Few true stories are entirely pleasant," she replied. "But they're honest. I value honesty above pleasantness." Caleb set his plate aside, gathering his thoughts. "I fought for the Union," he began. "Served under Sherman, saw things, did things that haunt me still. After the war, I drifted. Took work where I could find it: ranch hand, carpenter, occasional shotgun guard for stage coaches." Pearl listened attentively, her food forgotten as he continued. 4 years ago, I was working at a ranch in Kansas. Owner's daughter took a liking to me despite my discouragement. Her brother found us talking one evening, nothing improper, just conversation, and decided I'd overstepped. Called me out. Caleb's voice grew distant as he recalled that fateful night. He drew first, I was faster. He died there in the dust, and I had to run before his family strung me up without a trial. Pearl's expression remained steady, without horror or judgment. Self-defense isn't murder, Caleb. His family didn't see it that way. His brothers tracked me through 3 territories. Caught up to me in Santa Fe. Unconsciously, Caleb touched the scar on his face. Got this as a souvenir before I managed to get away. One of them didn't walk away from that fight either. He looked down at his hands, calloused, capable of both creation and destruction. So I kept moving until I found Lyndon. Bought land far enough from town to keep to myself, close enough to get supplies when needed. Thought I'd found peace until I arrived and disrupted your solitude, Pearl finished softly. Caleb's gaze lifted to meet hers. I don't regret that disruption. A moment of understanding passed between them, profound in its simplicity. Thank you for telling me, Pearl said, reaching for his hand, for trusting me with your truth. Doesn't change what people think, he pointed out. No, she agreed. But it changes what I know. Her fingers interlaced with his. And I know you to be honorable, Caleb, gentle in your strength. That word again, gentle, spoken with such conviction that part of him began to believe it might be true. The afternoon passed in companionable conversation, Pearl reading aloud from the Count of Monte Cristo, while Caleb listened, occasionally asking questions or offering observations that surprised her with their insight. As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across their sanctuary, neither seemed eager to end their time together. It's getting late, Caleb finally observed, reluctance evident in his voice. Should head back before dark. Pearl nodded, closing the book with a sigh. Yes, I suppose we should. As they packed the remains of their picnic, she glanced at him sideways. Mrs. Sullivan is visiting her sister in Denver this weekend. Caleb paused, uncertain of her meaning. What I mean to say, Pearl continued, a faint blush coloring her cheeks, is that I'll be dining alone this evening. If you'd care to join me, there's no one to object. The invitation hung between them, its implications clear. Caleb studied her face, searching for signs of uncertainty or impropriety. He found only genuine affection and a touch of nervousness that matched his own. I'd be honored, he replied simply. The ride back to town was filled with anticipation, a current of unspoken possibility running between them. They took care to approach the boarding house from the rear alley, mindful of prying eyes despite the boldness of their decision. The private dining room where they'd first shared a meal had been transformed. Pearl had clearly prepared for this possibility. Fresh flowers adorned the table, candles waited to be lit, and the curtains were drawn against curious gazes. I hope this isn't too presumptuous, she said as she lit the candles. I wanted to create something special, regardless of whether you accepted. Caleb took in the scene, touched by the effort, and thought she'd invested. It's perfect, he assured her, surprising himself with the sincerity of the sentiment. The meal was simpler than their first dinner, a beef stew Pearl had prepared herself, warm bread from the bakery, and a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a special occasion. The intimacy of sharing food she'd cooked with her own hands wasn't lost on Caleb, who found himself more moved by this gesture than by any grand display. As they ate, their conversation flowed naturally, punctuated by comfortable silences that required no filling. Pearl spoke of her dreams for the school-expanded classrooms, more books, perhaps even a small library for the town. Caleb shared tentative plans for his ranch breeding horses specifically suited to mountain work, possibly expanding his cattle herd. You make it sound as though you're planning to stay in Lyndon, Pearl observed. Caleb considered this. Hadn't thought much beyond the next season before. Now, he met her gaze. Now I find myself thinking longer term. The implication wasn't lost on Pearl, whose smile held a warmth that reached beyond friendship. I'm glad to hear it. I've grown quite fond of Colorado myself. After dinner, they moved to a small settee near the fireplace. The spring evening had brought a chill that made the flames welcome, casting a golden glow across the room. They sat close, not quite touching but aware of every inch between them. "Caleb," Pearl began, her voice softer than before, "I want you to know that I've never. That is, I'm not in the habit of." Understanding her struggle, Caleb gently took her hand. "I know, neither am I," relief crossed her features. "It's just that I've come to care for you, deeply, more than I anticipated when I first arrived in Lyndon." "Same here," he admitted, the simple words carrying the weight of profound emotion. "Never expected to find someone like you, someone who'd see past the rumors, the reputation," she supplied when he faltered. "I've always preferred to form my own impressions." "And what impression have you formed?" he asked, vulnerability evident despite his attempt at lightness. Pearl's free hand rose to touch his face, fingers tracing the edge of his scar with infinite tenderness. "That you are a man of honor, of strength, of unexpected gentleness." Her touch lingered at the corner of his mouth, where the scar pulled his lip into what others mistook for a perpetual sneer. "That I have fallen in love with you, despite all logic and propriety." The declaration, spoken without hesitation, stunned Caleb into momentary silence. Love was a concept he'd long ago relegated to the realm of impossibility for someone with his past, his reputation. "You can't mean that," he whispered hoarsely. "I assure you I do," she replied, unwavering. "I am not given to flights of fancy or impulsive declarations, Caleb. When I say I love you, it is with full understanding of what that means." Caleb's hand trembled slightly as he cupped her cheek. "I don't deserve your love." "Love isn't about deserving," she countered gently. "It simply is. The question is whether you return it." In that moment, confronted with her courage and honesty, Caleb could offer nothing less. "I do," he confessed, the words releasing something long constrained within him. "God help me, Pearl, I love you more than I thought possible." The distance between them vanished as Pearl leaned forward, her lips meeting his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened with shared emotion. Caleb's arms encircled her, drawing her closer as years of loneliness and self-imposed isolation melted away beneath the warmth of her embrace. When they finally parted, breathless and flushed, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. "What happens now?" he asked, practical concerns intruding on the moment. Pearl's smile held both contentment and determination. "Now we face whatever comes together." The following Sunday morning found Lyndon abuzz with fresh gossip. Caleb Norris had been seen entering the Sullivan boarding house Saturday evening and departing at dawn. Pearl Nichols had been notably absent from her usual place in the church choir. By noon, speculation had reached fever pitch, with reactions ranging from scandalized whispers to surprisingly supportive comments from those who had witnessed Caleb's transformation in recent weeks. The talk reached its crescendo when both Caleb and Pearl arrived at the church for afternoon services together. They made no attempt to hide their association, sitting side by side in a pew near the back. Though some congregants pointedly changed seats, others nodded in cautious acknowledgement. After the service, as they descended the church steps, Deputy Wheeler intercepted them, his face tight with disapproval. "Miss Nichols, a word," he said tersely. "The school board has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning regarding your situation." Pearl straightened her spine, her hand firmly tucked in Caleb's arm. "I presume you mean my personal life, Deputy?" Wheeler's gaze flicked to their linked arms. "Your conduct has raised concerns about your suitability as a moral example to impressionable children." "I see," she replied evenly. "Please inform the board I'll be there, with Mr. Norris as my character witness." Wheeler's eyes widened. "That would be highly irregular, as is this entire proceeding," Pearl interrupted, her tone polite but unyielding. "If my personal associations are to be scrutinized, I insist on the right to present those associations accurately." Without waiting for a response, she guided Caleb away, her head high despite the stares following them down the street. "You sure about this?" Caleb asked once they were beyond earshot. "Involving me might make things worse." "Hiding you would make me a coward and a hypocrite," Pearl replied firmly. "I've done nothing shameful by loving you, Caleb. I won't act as though I have." Her courage humbled him, even as he worried about the consequences. "The board could terminate your position. Everything you've worked for is meaningless if I compromise my principles to keep it." she finished. Besides, I have faith that reason will prevail. Caleb wished he shared her optimism. His experience suggested otherwise. The board meeting was held in the town hall, a modestly imposing building that served multiple civic functions. All 5 board members were present: Jacob Miller, whom Caleb had worked alongside on the roof, Reverend Thompson, Dr. Ellison, Mrs. Whitaker, the mayor's wife, and Samuel Peterson, the shopkeeper. Deputy Wheeler stood nearby, clearly hoping to witness Pearl's professional downfall. Sheriff Blake was also present, his expression inscrutable as Caleb and Pearl entered together. "Miss Nichols," Reverend Thompson began, his tone grave. "We've called this meeting to address concerns about your recent conduct and its potential impact on your role as educator to Lyndon's children." Pearl, dressed in her most professional attire, stood before them with dignity. "I understand, Reverend. Before we proceed, I'd like to introduce Caleb Norris, who has asked to speak on my behalf." A murmur ran through the small assembly. Reverend Thompson frowned. "Miss Nichols, this is highly unusual, no more unusual than convening to discuss a teacher's private life," Pearl countered smoothly. "If my personal associations are relevant to my professional capabilities, then surely hearing from the association in question is appropriate." The board members exchanged uncertain glances. Finally, Jacob Miller cleared his throat. "I'd like to hear what Norris has to say." With that opening, Caleb stepped forward. He had spent the night preparing what to say, knowing this might be Pearl's only chance to save her position. "I understand your concerns," he began, his voice steadier than he felt. "You're worried about the influence I might have on Miss Nichols and through her on your children. My reputation precedes me." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "That reputation isn't entirely undeserved. I've lived a hard life, made choices I regret. But the man who arrived in Lyndon 3 years ago isn't the same man standing before you today." Caleb's gaze swept the room, meeting each board member's eyes in turn. "Miss Nichols saw something in me that I'd forgotten existed. She called me gentle when everyone else saw only danger, and somehow, because she believed it, I began to remember how to be that man again." His voice softened. "I love her, more than I thought possible. And I want to be worthy of her love, which means being the kind of man this town can accept, not just tolerate." Mrs. Whitaker, whose expression had gradually softened during Caleb's speech, spoke up. "What exactly are your intentions toward Miss Nichols, Mr. Norris?" Caleb turned to Pearl, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "With her permission," he addressed the board, "I intend to ask for her hand in marriage." The declaration caused another stir, this one less disapproving than the first. "Marriage," Reverend Thompson repeated, clearly caught off guard. "Yes," Caleb confirmed. "I'd like to do things properly, build her a home worthy of her on my land, give her the security and respect she deserves." He hesitated, then added, "If the board is concerned about propriety, I hope an engagement might address those concerns." Pearl stepped forward to stand beside him. "I appreciate the board's dedication to maintaining standards for our children. I share that commitment. But I would ask you to consider whether loving a good man regardless of his past truly undermines those standards. Isn't forgiveness, redemption, and seeing the best in others exactly what we should be teaching?" A thoughtful silence followed her words. Finally, Jacob Miller spoke. "My boy hasn't stopped talking about how Mr. Norris taught him to use a level when they were fixing the school roof. Says he wants to learn carpentry now." Samuel Peterson added, "Norris has been nothing but fair in his business dealings, pays his accounts promptly, never causes trouble." Dr. Ellison, who had remained quiet until now, cleared his throat. "I've noticed a change in him these past months. Less intimidating, more engaged with the town." Mrs. Whitaker looked to Reverend Thompson, who seemed to be wrestling with his convictions. "The Bible does speak extensively about redemption," the Reverend admitted reluctantly. After a brief private consultation, Reverend Thompson addressed Pearl and Caleb. "The board has decided that, conditional upon a formal engagement with appropriate chaperoning until the wedding, Miss Nichols may retain her position. However," he added sternly, "we expect exemplary conduct from both of you." Relief washed over Pearl's face. "Thank you, you won't regret this decision." As they left the town hall, Caleb felt lighter than he had in years. The prospect of a future with Pearl One acknowledged and accepted by the community seemed almost too good to be true. "Did you mean what you said in there?" Pearl asked as they walked toward the boarding house. "About marriage," Caleb stopped, turning to face her. "Every word. Though I'd planned something more romantic than a town hall declaration." Her smile was radiant. "I don't need romance, Caleb, just you. You deserve both," he insisted. "And if you'll have me, I'd like to give you a proper proposal when the time is right." Pearl's eyes shimmered with unshed tears of happiness. "I look forward to it." In the weeks that followed, Lyndon witnessed a transformation in both the town's most feared resident and its beloved schoolteacher. Their courtship, conducted with scrupulous propriety under Mrs. Sullivan's watchful eye, became a topic of interest rather than scandal. Caleb began attending community events he'd previously avoided: the Independence Day celebration, Sunday socials after church, even a town meeting where his suggestion about improving the main street's drainage was received with serious consideration rather than automatic dismissal. Pearl, for her part, flourished under the security of Caleb's devotion. Her classroom became a model of innovation, with practical lessons that incorporated Caleb's expertise in carpentry and ranching alongside traditional subjects. Enrollment increased, as even formerly skeptical parents recognized the value of her teaching. By late summer, Caleb had completed renovations to his ranch house, transforming the bachelor cabin into a comfortable home with a proper parlor, expanded kitchen, and additional bedrooms for the future, as he explained to Pearl during her chaperone visits. On a perfect September evening, with the mountains blazing gold and crimson in the sunset, Caleb led Pearl to an overlook on his property that provided a panoramic view of the valley and distant peaks. "I've been waiting for the right moment," he told her, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. "Wanted everything to be perfect." Pearl squeezed his hand. "It already is." Caleb took a deep breath and lowered himself to one knee, withdrawing a small box from his pocket. Inside nestled a modest but beautifully crafted gold ring set with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. "Pearl Nichols," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart, "you saw gentleness in me when I'd forgotten it existed. You believed in me when no one else would. You loved me when I thought love was impossible." He held the ring up, catching the last rays of sunlight. "Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears spilled down Pearl's cheeks as she nodded emphatically. "Yes, Caleb, 1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, then rose to gather her in his arms, Caleb marveled at the journey that had brought them here from feared outcast to respected community member, from solitary existence to shared life, from hardened survivor to a man rediscovering the gentle heart he'd buried beneath years of defensive walls. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "More than I have words to express." Pearl leaned back to meet his gaze, her eyes reflecting the depth of emotion in his own. "You express it every day, my gentle cowboy, in everything you do." For perhaps the first time in his adult life, Caleb embraced the description without reservation. Gentle. In Pearl's eyes, it wasn't a weakness but a strength one she had helped him reclaim, one touch, one word, one act of faith at a time. Their wedding took place on a crisp October morning, with the entire town in attendance. The church, decorated with autumn flowers and golden leaves, had never seemed more welcoming to Caleb as he waited at the altar for his bride. When Pearl appeared at the entrance on Jacob Miller's arm, her father being deceased and Miller having volunteered for the honor, a hush fell over the congregation. She wore a gown of ivory silk, simple yet elegant, with her honey-colored hair arranged in soft curls beneath a lace veil. As she joined him before Reverend Thompson, Caleb felt a sense of rightness so profound it nearly overwhelmed him. This woman, this remarkable, courageous, loving woman had chosen him, believed in him, transformed him through nothing more complex than seeing the best in him and refusing to accept less. Their vows were traditional but spoken with deeply personal meaning. When Caleb promised to love, honor, and cherish Pearl for all his days, those who knew him best recognized the unshakable commitment behind the words. When Pearl pledged herself to him in return, Her voice rang with joyful certainty. The celebration afterward at the town hall was the most festive Lyndon had seen in years. Even Deputy Wheeler, who had gradually come to accept the inevitable, offered grudging congratulations. Sheriff Blake presented them with a hand-carved chess set he'd been working on for months. The schoolchildren performed a special song they'd prepared under Mrs. Sullivan's guidance. As evening fell and the newlyweds prepared to depart for their home, Pearl threw her bouquet directly to young Mary Peterson, whose blush suggested she might be the next to marry. Caleb helped his wife into their wagon, decorated with ribbons and flowers by well-wishers, and they set off amid cheers and good-natured teasing. The ranch house welcomed them with warmth and light, Caleb having arranged for Mrs. Sullivan to prepare it earlier in the day. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting golden patterns across the new curtains Pearl had sewn for their home. On the table waited a simple supper and a bottle of champagne, an extravagance Caleb had ordered specially from Denver. "Welcome home, Mrs. Norris," he said softly as he carried her across the threshold. Pearl's arms tightened around his neck. "It sounds wonderful when you say it." That night, as they discovered each other with tender passion, Caleb understood fully what Pearl had meant by gentleness being strength under control. In her arms, he found both liberation and anchor, both fire and peace. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed in the quiet darkness afterward, Pearl nestled against his chest. "A home that's more than just shelter, a life that's more than just survival." Pearl traced the scar on his face, the gesture now one of familiar affection rather than discovery. "You always had the capacity for it. You just needed someone to remind you." As winter settled over Lyndon, the Norris household became known for its hospitality. Sunday dinners frequently included Mrs. Sullivan, occasionally expanded to include Jacob Miller and his family or Samuel Peterson and his wife. The once feared ranch became a gathering place for community celebrations, schoolhouse meetings, and impromptu educational excursions for Pearl's students. Caleb's expertise with horses gained recognition beyond the immediate area, bringing buyers from as far as Denver and establishing a reputation for quality that ensured their financial security. Pearl continued teaching, her classroom now expanded to include practical lessons conducted at the ranch during favorable weather. By their first anniversary, Pearl's subtle glow and gently rounded figure announced the impending arrival of the next generation. The news was celebrated throughout town, with handcrafted gifts appearing on their doorstep from seemingly every household. "They've fully accepted you now," Pearl observed one evening as they sorted through the latest offerings, a hand-knitted blanket from Mrs. Whitaker, a miniature rocking horse from Jacob Miller. "Us." Caleb's hand rested protectively on her growing belly. "They've accepted who I've become, who you helped me remember I could be." "You did the work," she countered, covering his hand with her own. "I just saw what was already there." In the spring of 1878, their son was born, Charles Jacob Norris, named for Caleb's father and the friend who had stood by them when acceptance seemed unlikely. The birth was attended by Dr. Ellison and Mrs. Sullivan, with Caleb pacing anxiously until the healthy cries of his firstborn son filled their home. Holding Charles for the first time, Caleb experienced a tenderness so profound it brought tears to eyes that hadn't wept since childhood. This tiny life, half him, half Pearl, wholly miraculous, represented everything he'd once believed beyond his reach: legacy, continuity, unconditional love. "He has your eyes," Pearl murmured tiredly from the bed, her face radiant despite her exhaustion. "And your strength." "Let's hope he has your wisdom," Caleb replied, carefully placing the swaddled infant in her arms. "And your ability to see the best in people." As Charles grew from infant to toddler, the ranch expanded to accommodate their evolving needs. Caleb added a nursery adjacent to their bedroom, a larger kitchen where Pearl could teach their son alongside her other domestic skills, a workshop where father and son could eventually create together. 2 years later, Charles was joined by a sister, Elizabeth Grace, with Pearl's honey-colored hair and her father's determined chin. The family of 4 established rhythms and traditions that blended Pearl's Eastern refinement with Caleb's practical Western sensibilities. Life wasn't without challenges. Drought threatened their livelihood one summer, requiring Caleb to drive their horses to higher pastures while Pearl managed the homestead. Scarlet fever swept through Lyndon when Charles was 4, keeping the family quarantined for weeks as Pearl nursed both children through the illness. Economic downturns occasionally affected horse sales, requiring careful management of their resources. But through each difficulty, they faced the challenge together, their partnership strengthened rather than strained by adversity. The foundation they'd built on honesty, mutual respect, and unwavering belief in each other proved solid enough to weather any storm. By the time Lyndon celebrated the arrival of the railroad in 1883, the Norrises had become pillars of the community. Caleb served on the town council, his practical knowledge and fair-mindedness valued in civic decisions. Pearl had advanced to school principal, implementing educational reforms that attracted positive attention from territorial authorities. Their home, once a bachelor's refuge on the outskirts of town, had evolved into a place where neighbors gathered, children played, and strangers received welcome. The feared loner who had arrived in Lyndon 8 years earlier was now remembered only in stories that seemed increasingly improbable to those who knew only the present Caleb Norris, respected rancher, devoted husband, gentle father. On their 10th wedding anniversary, as they sat on the porch watching Charles and Elizabeth chase fireflies in the gathering dusk, Pearl leaned against her husband's shoulder contentedly. 10 years, she mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that I walked into Peterson's store and met the scowling man everyone feared, Caleb chuckled, his arm tightening around her. Sometimes it feels like a different lifetime, a different man. Not different, Pearl corrected, turning to meet his gaze. Just remembered, you were always capable of this, Caleb, of being loved, of loving in return. Her hand rose to his face, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together, of gentleness. In the distance, their children's laughter mingled with the evening birdsong, a harmony of innocence and joy that validated every choice, every risk, every act of faith that had brought them to this moment. You were right, Caleb acknowledged, capturing her hand and pressing a kiss to her palm. That first time you called me gentle, I thought you were seeing things that weren't there. Turns out you were seeing things I'd forgotten existed. As darkness settled over their land and stars began to appear above the mountains, Pearl rested her head on his shoulder once more. That's what love does, she said softly. It reminds us who we truly are. And in the peaceful sanctuary, they had built together their home, their family, their shared life. Caleb Norris, once the most feared man in Lyndon, embraced the truth of who he had become. A gentle soul who had found his way back to himself through the unwavering belief of the woman who had seen beyond his scars to the heart beneath.